Hey everyone, welcome to this first quarterly Azure update. This is for Q3 2021. So the features that were introduced in Azure July, August, September. I'm trying this out because people have asked for a kind of summarized, less detailed quarterly update, maybe more for sales people. So I'm going to give it a go. But obviously, ordinarily, what I do is I have my weekly update. So the weekly update is still the place I would generally recommend you want to go if you actually want the real detail about everything. You can see here every week on Sunday, I post the update. You can always go and see the old ones on the playlist of Azure Infrastructure Updates. So that's really where all the detail is. But maybe if you just want kind of a summary of the high level things for the last quarter, I'm going to try and do that here. As always, if this is useful, a like, subscribe, comment, and share is really appreciated, and hit the bell icon. So let's dive in. So on the compute side, many virtual machines had storage bursting GA. This used to be limited to just like the L series, some of the E and the D series. And you can really think about virtual machines have certain characteristics and limits. So for storage, it has a certain amount of IOPS, operations it can perform, and throughput. Well, what this bursting ability does now, at the VM limit level, it can actually exceed those limits for small durations. So up to 30 minutes, if I've got credit accrued and I start with a full bucket, I can exceed my regular IOPS and throughput. So maybe I have some storage burst level requirement. Well, I can now do that with my regular size virtual machine. Obviously, you need to make sure the storage has the necessary IOPS and throughput. And remember, many of the disks now have bursting as well. So the ability to exceed my regular provision performance for a limited time window. So many VMs now have that capability. The ACE v3 GA, so this is the app service environment. If you think about a regular app service plan runs in a multi-tenant set of infrastructure. There might be certain worker nodes where my app runs that is just mine, but there are other shared components that make the entire solution work. That limits certain things I can do. It complicates things like integrating with virtual networks. I have to delegate subnets or use VPNs or use private endpoints. So the app service environment v3, it deploys into a dedicated subnet in my virtual network that then makes it seamless to both talk to the things running in the app service environment and for the app service environment apps to actually talk to things in my virtual network or connected networks. Big difference with v3 is there's no stamp fee anymore. I just pay for my isolated v2 virtual machines that actually power this. Also, it uses kind of some wizardry behind the scenes that there are no particular networking requirements I have to have in place so it can function. I used to be very careful that maybe I break it if I restricted certain types of traffic. Well, now the ACE v3 essentially has its own invisible network that we don't see on a Microsoft area that it uses for infrastructure purposes, and the vnet we give it is just really used for the customer traffic. So it simplifies a lot of things. It now has availability zone support if it's available in the region. So just a cheaper option and great functionality, great performance. It's built on virtual machine scale sets. Azure Kubernetes service has had a huge amount of investments. So if you think about regular Kubernetes, we'd have to deploy the whole control plane. Things like the API service, the scheduler, the controllers, the etcd database, maintain that, maintain the kubelets that run on the nodes. AKS takes that entire control plane and it's just a service for us. So what they've done now is things like integrate with Azure AD. I don't have to have local accounts anymore. I can just integrate with Azure AD and use roles that tie to Azure AD groups. There are now smart defaults. So if I actually now go and create a new Kubernetes cluster, for example, so if I just jump over here, in the past it would be, well, what settings do I want? So now if I was going to create a new Kubernetes cluster, one of the great things is you have this preset configuration. And I can actually say, hey, I want it for dev test or cost optimized or batch or hardened access. And it changes the virtual machine SKUs it uses. It changes, hey, am I going to have multiple node pools? What features am I going to turn on? So it helps really rationalize all of the options to give me some good initial defaults for my actual cluster. So that's a super nice thing they've added in there. I can now create custom policies for AKS. So in addition to the regular Azure policies for containers, I can create my own ones. This is all built on Gatekeeper, so I can have my own restrictions. It now uses a CSI driver, for things like the storage. That's now separate from the Kubernetes kernel, so it can be updated. But also now there are CSI drivers for things like Azure Key Vault. So I could now expose things like secrets in Key Vault, just like part of a file system in the pods to simplify that kind of access. I can have private AKS clusters. So that management plane I referenced, actually rather than having a public endpoint, it is a private endpoint. So remember, a private endpoint is an IP address within our virtual network. Well, if I use that option, I can still now publish a public DNS record that points to that IP, which is really useful if I have other networks connected to it that want to actually use that management plane. So that's a nice option. And likewise, I now have a run command option. So I can use a run command via sort of the AZ CLI that will use the AKS API. So even if I have that private endpoint, and even if I'm not on the network, I can still send commands to it, like AZ, AKS, command invoke, kubectl, git nodes. That will now work. It has scale down modes. So we have these worker nodes that run our pods. And there's auto scale capabilities. So based on the scheduler's ability to schedule pods, it might add nodes. If there's too many nodes, it can scale them in. I can now pick, well, does it delete the nodes or does it just deprovision them? The benefit of maybe just deprovisioning them is that they'll actually start up much faster. If there were images pre-cached, they're already going to be there. The downside is if I deprovision, I stop paying for the compute, but I'd still pay for the disks. So I'll pay more, but they'll come back faster. So there were a whole bunch of different options around AKS, so a big investment area. VMware Site Recovery Manager now works with the Azure VMware solution. So remember, the Azure VMware solution is VMware running in Azure data centers. This is really useful if I have VMware on-prem and I need to quickly maybe get out of my data center but don't want to retool, don't want to relearn. I can actually just move my virtual machines, I can vMotion them into these private clusters I create in Azure data centers. They can hook into network through things like ExpressRoute Global Reach. They can hook into Azure services. Well, Site Recovery Manager, which is the disaster recovery solution for planning and failover and failback, well, those Azure VMware Solution private clusters can now be part of that. Also, third-party Jetstream DR now works for AVS as well, from on-prem VMware to AVS, and from one AVS private cluster to another AVS private cluster. There's now an automatic Azure VM extensions upgrade. Now, this isn't for all extensions, but if you think about extensions add functionality to a virtual machine, if there's a new version, now it can automatically roll out that new version in an availability first method, i.e. it doesn't just deploy it all at once. It can think about availability zone by availability zone. It checks the success criteria, does a certain portion, can roll back. So it's really kind of a availability first principle to make sure we don't risk the availability of the service. And then GitHub codespaces. This is this really great ability that it will basically provision a Azure-based resource to run our development environment, to do our builds, to have all that tooling. It basically provides a web-based VS Code environment that I can go and have instant access to my whole repo, just spun up, resources there, really lets me work from anywhere. So this was a really cool capability. And regular app service plans now have availability zone support. So that's separate from the ACE. This is just regular, those multi-tenant app service plans. I can now have AZ support. It must be the Premium V2 or Premium V3 plans, and I have to create a new plan. Today I set that via the ARM portal. There's a properties, I set zone redundant to true, but now I can have an AZ app service plan. Obviously I need 3 nodes, 3 worker nodes to be able to span the 3 zones. On the networking side, so Azure Firewall Premium went GA. So this is a first-party firewall appliance. It's built on actual policies rather than the old classic rules which were per firewall. So the policy is its own object that I then apply to a firewall instance. And really what Premium did is it added a whole bunch of functionality. Now I did a whole deep dive video, really focused and demoed all of the Premium features. If you want to go and look at that, you can. But it added things like TLS inspection. So it would sit in between the client and the target. It would generate a certificate the client will trust and can then inspect even encrypted traffic. Now that ability to inspect the TLS encrypted traffic now means it can do things like detect even attacks if it's encrypted traffic. It can do filtering even if it's going over encrypted traffic. It can even based on the path if it's encrypted TLS, which normally it can't even see. So there was an intrusion detection prevention system added. This is really based on daily updated signatures, so it can alert or block. It can do URL-based filtering, again, even on that TLS protected traffic. It has web categories, so gambling, search, news, based on both URL and the fully qualified domain name. So fully qualified domain name it could always do. Now it's that URL which has the path as well. There were new ExpressRoute peering locations, ExpressRoute direct locations, and global reach locations. So if you're not sure what all of that is, fundamentally it boils down to the idea that Microsoft runs a great big global network. And anytime you see like Azure regions, it essentially connects to that great big Microsoft backbone. And then there's basically a customer. If they want to connect their network to the Microsoft backbone, well, what actually happens is Microsoft at certain locations, they extend their network into these locations. And so what I can do as a customer is either maybe it's via my existing MPLS and my provider has a hook in, or it's a direct connection. Through my provider, I kind of get a connection and they cross-connect. So now I've connected my network through a provider to the Microsoft backbone, and then I could do things like private peering that connects me to a certain virtual network, or Microsoft peering. I can advertise certain services like storage or SQL to my network. So what they're doing is adding more of these peering locations. So it's good for me, so where my data center or office is, I can have a peering location closer to my office so I can get onto the Microsoft backbone faster. When you talk about ExpressRoute direct, so rather than going via a provider, maybe I'm a really big company and I actually have my own switches at these locations. I don't want to go through a provider. I want to take my router, I have kind of routers here, and I want to just connect them directly to Microsoft routers. So what ExpressRoute Direct lets you do is that. I can actually have these active, so I get these redundant connections that I'm directly connecting through in either 10 or 100 gigabit per second ports. And on top of those ports, I create circuits up to the limit of what my port is. I can actually go beyond that. So that's direct. So if I'm a really big company, I have my own routers, I get these letters of authorization to let me actually do those connections. I can then do things like MACsec to encrypt, and I have that. And then, so global reach is about the idea that, hey, I might have multiple locations that I've kind of connected through, and I actually want to route to them through the Microsoft backbone. So global reach lets me say, hey, I'm going to get to you over that Microsoft backbone. So again, more locations now support that as well. So it's just really good from a whole connectivity perspective. So that's what all of those things are about. Private Link has expanded its support. So I've sort of mentioned the word Private Link a couple of times. So Private Link, again, is all about the idea that as a customer, I have a virtual network. And in that virtual network, I have subnets. It's a portion of the IP space. Ordinarily, services like a storage account, they have kind of a public endpoint, a public IP. What private endpoints let me do is it actually takes an IP from my subnet that actually goes to a particular instance of a service, and then it basically disables that public point. So there's just been a continual investment in the private endpoints. For example, things like network security groups and user-defined routes now apply to private endpoints as well. So I can restrict kind of the flow of communications with network security groups. And with UDRs, I could say, hey, if the target is a private endpoint, send it via this virtual appliance first. I want to change the next hop before it then goes to that private endpoint. So a continual investment there. Many services, again, continue to add private endpoint support. For example, Azure Key Vault Managed HSM, which is a dedicated security domain for my keys, that now supports private endpoints. Azure Static Web Apps now support private endpoints to actually get that access if I'm using a standard plan. So just lots and lots of work all about private endpoints. I can now resize peered VNets. So this whole idea of this virtual network, well, if there's another virtual network, I can peer them. So they can now communicate on that Microsoft backbone. But one of the issues was a virtual network is essentially one or more side ranges, groups of IPs. I couldn't change this. I couldn't add new ones if it had a peer. Well, now we can. We can actually resize it in preview. And again, I did a video detailing this. In the description below, I have all of the different links. I can now resize. I do a sync process, but I can resize peered VNets. And Route Server went GA. If I think about network virtual appliances, ordinarily we have to create those user-defined routes. Hey, if you're going here, your next hop is actually this thing over here. With Route Server, it allows those network virtual appliances via BGP, which is basically a way to advertise routes, to talk to the virtual network to say, hey, this is an address space I talk to, so if you have things going to this address space, send it to me. It means I don't have to manually add UDRs. Likewise, these devices can learn about the various routes of the VNet. So a super powerful feature. On the storage side, shared disks for now all premium and standard SSD disks. So if we think about a managed disk, ordinarily a managed disk, which again abstracts the storage accounts, this is a managed disk, it used to just be able to connect to a single virtual machine. So what shared disks lets me do is, as the name really suggests, multiple machines connect to it at the same time. It emulates things like SCSI persistent reservations, so I could create cluster shared volumes in Windows clusters. I can do this in Linux. So anytime I need like a shared disk in some kind of cluster, I can now do this with managed disks for all of the premium and standard SSDs. Now, the exact number of machines that can connect does vary based on the size. So here, for example, if we look at the documentation, it tells us, well, for the premium SSDs, it's kind of this, well, hey, you have 3, 5, or 10, depending on the size. If it's standard, once again, you kind of get this 3, 5, or 10, depending on the size. And then for ultra disks, there's a minimum value of 1, and the maximum is 5. So you kind of just set this whatever you want it to be. But now I can have that fantastic shareability if I need it. Also, one of the nice things about this as well is it does support ZRS. So ZRS is that zone redundant storage. So those virtual machines could actually be in different availability zones, so giving me even more resiliency. On-demand disk bursting. So this is the idea that I talked before about, hey, we have those buckets of burst for VMs, and I said disks have them as well. But it's kind of a finite time window. What this feature does is this lets me actually say, hey, for the bigger disks, so the P30s and above, I think that's 1 terabyte, I can turn on-demand bursting. And I then pay for the additional performance. I pay in kind of chunks of megabytes per second and IOPS, but there's no limit. I can just keep kind of exceeding as I need to. Premium SSDs now have dynamic change. So if you think what this is all about, is ordinarily, if I think about this disk, well, I can pick different sizes. So I can really think about kind of size and performance. And as I increase the size, the performance goes up as well. And I can make disks bigger, but I can't shrink them. So what this capability lets me do is now there's two characteristics of the disk. There's the size, which has an inherent performance, but I can separately say, well, actually, I'm this size, but I need this level of performance. So I can raise the performance characteristic of the disk without having to resize it. The benefit there is then I can shrink the performance back down again if it's not a permanent increase in performance I actually need. So if we actually went and looked, for example, so if I jump over here, and if I look at disks, let's look at what we have. So this is just a standard, so it's not going to actually show it very well on this. But essentially, if you have size and performance, what you'd have on a premium disk, so let's actually just jump over super quickly to a different subscription. So over here, if I look at my disks, and we'll just pick, there we go. So that's a premium. What we'll actually see is, hey, notice here we have a certain, that's its current size, and that's the performance I get. But what I can do, if I scroll down, I could actually give it a higher performance tier. And then I think it's every 12 hours, I could shrink it back down. So it lets me get a higher performance without having to resize the disk. So I can then shrink it again at some point in the future. So that's kind of an important thing to do because I don't want to have to do that resize. Then there's now managed disk ZRS that I mentioned already. I can have the 3 copies of the disk on different AZs. Automatic customer managed key rotation. So customer managed key says, hey, that at-rest encryption, instead of being a Microsoft managed key, the key used to protect the actual disk encryption key is stored in Azure Key Vault as a key. Well, with this feature, when I create a new version of that key in the Key Vault, it will automatically get seen and it will start using it. I don't have to manually go and do anything. There's a little time delay of that, but it's just going to all happen for us automatically. Immutable storage for blob versions. So I can have versions of blobs. It can track it in time. And I can do time-based holds. I can do legal holds actually on that content. I can apply it to current versions of the blob. I can apply it to older versions. Azure Blob Inventory and last access time went GA. So this enables me to create a file, maybe every night, of the current content of my storage account. And then I can go and grab that file. Likewise, there's now a last access time attribute. This is really useful if I think about life cycle. So there's different tiers in storage accounts: hot, cool, archive. And I might write rules to say, hey, if it's not being modified for a certain number of days, move it to cool, which is cheaper. Well, now my rule could also say, hey, if it's not been accessed for a certain amount of time, move it to another tier. So this really improves my ability to do lifecycle. And Azure Files added 3.1.1 support. This lets me do things like multi-session on Azure Files now. So multiple connections that are kind of aggregated together, give me better resiliency, better overall performance. Database. So Azure SQL managed instance for Azure Arc. Remember, Azure Arc is about bringing Azure capabilities anywhere, other clouds, on premises. There's Azure Arc for servers, there's Azure Arc for Kubernetes. Now, when I have that Azure Arc for Kubernetes, any CNCF compatible Kubernetes cluster, I can then do other services on top of that. So I can do database services, I can do app services, and so what this actually has is, so it will deploy a SQL managed instance on top of my Azure Arc managed Kubernetes cluster. And so that's this kind of evergreen, lights up a bunch of functionality, but I can have that. Flexible server for managed MySQL and PostgreSQL had a whole bunch of features. So flexible server is different from the regular single server of these open source managed databases. So the big deal here is I could install MySQL, I could install PostgreSQL in VMs myself. But I'm managing that, I'm managing the OS, I'm managing the database, I'm doing all of that work tuning. These are PaaS offerings. I just focus on using the database. So the regular single instance was kind of container-based. These are more VM-based. So the benefit of that VM-based approach is I can start and stop them, so stop paying. I can use burstable virtual machines, so I get those bursts of performance for limited time windows. It is aware of availability zones. I can have high availability by having a standby instance that's having the data replicated to it, so I get very fast failover in the event of a disaster. But they've added things like within region, AZ high availability, private DNS integration, reserved instance pricing, just huge amounts of investment in flexible server for both MySQL and Postgres. The PostgreSQL Hyperscale, again, a lot of investment. So Hyperscale is built on Citus. So Citus is an extension for Postgres. If you think about ordinarily with a database, normally with a database, there's a box. I have a box, and that's running the database. And that has connections to storage. The performance is really based on what are the capabilities of that single box and the performance of the storage. What Citus does is Citus splits this. So I have the idea of kind of this single coordinator node, then it has a whole bunch of, you can kind of think of worker nodes that actually distribute all the work. So the requests come into the coordinator, but it introduces new types of object. There's something called a distributed table. And the distributed table, well, as the name suggests, it shards the data into chunks over these different servers that have their own storage. Then there are things like reference tables. These are tables that are replicated on each node. So if I'm doing joins, it's still going to be very high performant. And then the coordinator is in charge of kind of distributing the queries over. So I get huge scale and I get phenomenal performance. So again, just continual investment here about new versions of Citus supported, Postgres supported, features. But this is really, hey, I want this near infinite scale on Postgres. This is this managed offering. Those things like PG Bouncer is now a managed offering for this. That's the idea, hey, this client that connects, there's a finite number of connections. So what PG Bouncer does is it's a pool management. The connections is a PG Bouncer component instead, which then tracks the connections available and kind of allocates as they're there. So a great feature. Cosmos DB introduced continuous backup. So now I can do a point in time restore from any time within a certain window. So this lets me say, hey, from any 30-minute time slot, I can go back in time. I don't have to do anything. It's continually doing these backup capabilities. So I can go and restore myself through PowerShell, through Resource Manager, through the portal. I'm kind of in control and can do that. Oracle Virtual Machine consistent backups. So this is the idea that Oracle's running in a virtual machine. So hey, just a regular IaaS VM. And this database now is the Oracle software. One of the challenges is if I want to back it up from the fabric, how do I know it's not kind of mid-transaction? So what they've done is Azure Backup has some pre-scripts and post-scripts, before it actually takes the backup and after. And what it will do is it will essentially quiesce the database, so pause it, make sure everything's flushed out to disk, take the snapshot of the disk, and then unfreeze it. The benefit here is I'm getting that incremental snapshotting that the Azure Backup uses, so it's very efficient with the disk space, but it's still a consistent backup from an Oracle perspective. Miscellaneous, so Windows 365 went GA. So think of Windows 365 as really this just managed kind of VDI environment. There's two SKUs. There's a business and an enterprise. Business is really 300 users or less. It just integrates with Azure AD. There's no integration with your virtual networks. There's no custom images. There's no Intune, but it's super simple to go and stand that thing up. Enterprise is typically kind of more than 300 users. It's hybrid. So it will integrate with a virtual network in Azure to get communication to domain controllers. It uses MEM, Microsoft Endpoint Manager, and Intune for the management. Optionally, it can hook into Defender. It has custom image support. There's even continual investment in this thing. So you have this very easy to deploy option. And again, I did kind of a deep dive and a demonstration video of this. These are all personal desktops. There's no app publishing, there's no pooled desktops. This is a per user per month pricing. So it's very consistent and easy to know what you're going to get charged. Because it's personal desktops, it's not using FS Logics or any of those technologies. It's connecting with various cloud technologies, OneDrive for Business, enterprise state roaming, Edge to handle the personality of the user in those environments. But Azure Virtual Desktop doesn't go anywhere. So Azure Virtual Desktop is kind of that VDI solution in the cloud. It gives me far more flexibility for my environments. I can use things like FS Logics to split apart the profile. It has Windows 11 kind of preview support now, which is about to be released in a couple of days. It has screen capture protection. It has Start VM on Connect. So now rather than having to pay for the compute charge of the VM all the time for both pooled and personal, as I connect and as it needs it, it will start the VM up. It now has Azure AD based support, so I don't have to have line of sight to domain controllers. So there's a whole bunch of continual investments. So this isn't, oh, I don't need this anymore. This is a far more flexible, configurable capability option. I have app publishing options, I have pooled options, but maybe I just don't need that and I want a more consistent billing and just set it and forget it. So then Windows 365 might be the right option for me. Azure Image Builder went GA. This is the idea that, hey, I build my own images, maybe Windows or Linux. And the whole point of this is we don't want to manually build images. I want kind of a prescriptive file that has the config of what I want to do. And I throw that into an engine that spits out my image. I might want to do this routinely as, hey, there's a new version of the base OS released. I need to create a new version of my custom image. So Azure Image Builder does exactly that. It's built on the HashiCorp Packer technology. I give it the configuration file, and it will go and build my new custom images, put them in the shared image gallery, which itself can then be replicated to multiple regions. So super powerful. Azure Monitor dedicated clusters now have a 500 gigabyte per day minimum. So this lowered that minimum bar to get into a dedicated cluster from 1,000 gigabytes a day. The benefit of a dedicated cluster is it lets me have things like customer managed keys. It has customer lockbox, so I can control access to the environment from things like Microsoft engineers. I can do double encryption. I get better performance if I have multiple workspaces on the same cluster because they're on the same hardware. And I can get a discount across these as well. So there are benefits to getting this dedicated cluster, so the entry bar has been lowered. Azure Site Recovery now has global DR. So Azure Site Recovery is that native ability that it replicates a VM to somewhere else. Well, previously it had to kind of be in the same geographical boundary. Now it can be global. I can essentially replicate to anywhere. I can even replicate within region from one AZ to another AZ. So I get a lot of flexibility there. Azure Migrate added containerization support. So very often we're running a VM. We don't actually need to be running a VM. With a VM, we have to manage the whole OS. There's a whole overhead of the OS from the memory and the CPU and the disk storage it needs. There's a certain slowness to it. Many workloads could actually run in a container, which has kind of a shared kernel. They have a lower overhead. They're faster to provision. So the app migration containerization support will actually look at your ASP.NET, at your Java web applications running on Apache Tomcat, and will essentially create artifacts, Docker files, to create a Docker image of this that I can then use in App Service, in Azure Kubernetes Service to actually run it. And it will give me the artifacts it uses, like those Docker files, so that I could then use them in my own pipelines. So it's this really nice technology to help me get to kind of containers. Top Secret Cloud was announced, but don't tell anyone. So now there's multiple Gov clouds. So we think about, there's the Azure Commercial Cloud, which we mostly live in. There's the Azure Gov Cloud, which has kind of improved Department of Defense impact levels, ITAR, a whole bunch of other things. Then there's Azure Government Secret that has even more DoD impact levels and other certs. and that is Azure Government Top Secret that goes even further. So these are all separate clouds. Obviously, we have to get special permission to actually use these. Azure Policy now has guest configuration. So if we think about ordinarily, the whole point of Azure Policy is at the Azure Resource Manager level, I'm creating some resource. And that resource I create, well, I have certain controls, what region I can create it in, what SKU I can use, do I need DR for it? But if this was a virtual machine, inside there's actually an operating system. It could be Windows, Linux. Well, then I might want to do configuration of the guest OS itself. So now Azure Policy can actually do that. If it's Windows, it's going to use PowerShell desired state configuration. If it's Linux, it's going to use PowerShell desired state configuration. And it's also going to use Chef in spec. So through Azure Policy, I can now apply guest configuration in addition to Azure Resource Manager level configurations. So it's kind of a nice thing there. Azure AAD Connect V2 was released, and I did a video outlining what this is all about. And I just released another video making sure you're aware you need to be manually updating this. So I released a couple of videos about this, but this has some new requirements. But this is something you need to do in the next year. Actually, really the next 9 months to be safe. The Azure Monitor agent and data collection rules now support Windows Server 2022. So the Azure Monitor agent is the replacement for the old Log Analytics agent, the diagnostics extension, and the Telegraph for Linux. It brings them all together. And that gives me this centralized ability to define the rules that I want the agent to follow in terms of what data to collect and where to send it to. So this now has Windows Server 2022 support. And management group scopes are now available for Azure reservations. So if I think about ordinarily, I can think about, well, I have kind of an enterprise agreement. That's a billing agreement, essentially. And then inside there, I can create multiple subscriptions. So I create a sub. In that subscription, I have resource groups. So a reservation is basically a 3 or 5 year commitment to say, hey, I know I'm going to use at minimum this amount of family of VM or SQL or Cosmos DB, so I get a great big discount. When I do that reservation, I could apply that reservation at the subscription level, so anything in the sub, at the resource group level, anything in the resource group, or the enrollment, i.e. any sub within that entire enrollment. What they've added is, well, subscriptions actually live typically in management groups. There's kind of a root management group at the top of the Azure AD, and then I can have this whole hierarchy of management groups. So what I can now do is I can also apply the scope to be a certain management group level, which would then apply to all of the subs under that management group, etc. So I now have kind of 4 levels I can apply, and you can change the scope of reservations. And then capacity reservations went into preview. So if reserved Azure reservations says, hey, I'm going to commit to using this amount for a period of time, a capacity reservation is saying, hey, I need 10, DSV4, DS2 V4s. I need 10 of those in East US 2. And I pay for those if I'm using them or not. But it guarantees that capacity is there. And then I can create new resources into that reservation. So it's basically holding those slots available on servers, but I have to pay for that. It's like reserving rooms, and I'm paying for the room all the time. The benefit of that is it ensures the capacity is there. So if I know I'm going to do a big deployment, I could reserve that capacity in advance to make sure I don't get capacity problems when I do deploy. Maybe for DR, I have a few critical resources. I want to make sure there's always a certain capacity reserved for my workloads if I failed over. Well, I can use a capacity reservation. And I can use these 2 things together. So I can have a capacity reservation, and I know I'm going to always have that. So I could apply reserved instance to get discounts on that capacity reservation. And that was it. So that was our first quarterly update. Again, I had to pick what things I included in here. I recommend the weekly updates. They're only 10 to 20 minutes and I go into a lot more detail. But this was trying to catch you up on everything that happened in Q3. If people like it, I'll do them every quarter. We'll see what the feedback is. But a lot of work. Please like and subscribe. Until next time, take care.